The streets of Madagascar are burning with anger, fear, and the sound of change. Last night, in a shocking and decisive move, Madagascar's president dissolved his entire government after days of deadly youth-led protests shook the nation to its core. Tear gas, gunfire, and cries for justice filled the air as young demonstrators demanded an end to corruption, rising poverty, and political paralysis. These protests were not just marches. They were a battle of wills where frustrated youth faced off against heavily armed security forces in a tense standoff that claimed multiple lives. The images are haunting. Military vehicles blocking roads, soldiers in combat gear clashing with teenagers wielding nothing but their voices and homemade barricades. Welcome back to my channel. Tonight, we dive into this unfolding crisis where political chaos meets military power. Madagascar, an island nation often overlooked in global affairs, has suddenly become a flashpoint in the larger story of worldwide unrest. From Africa to Europe to the Middle East, young people are rising against governments they believe have failed them, and the response is increasingly militarized. The decision to dismiss the government isn't just about Madagascar's internal politics. It's a signal to the world that even fragile democracies are turning to extreme measures to contain dissent. Analysts warn that this move could ignite a dangerous power vacuum, inviting military factions to seize control and pushing the nation closer to civil conflict. And in a time when advanced surveillance drones, armored vehicles, and cutting-edge crowd control weapons are redefining how governments deal with protests, the stakes have never been higher. What happens in Madagascar may be a preview of how future uprisings across the globe will be fought, not just with words, but with the cold machinery of war. As the dust settles over Antananarivo, capital remains under a tense military watch. Soldiers patrol the streets with advanced armored carriers, and drones buzz overhead, tracking every movement. What began as a youth-driven call for reform has evolved into a confrontation where modern military technology meets raw public fury. Eyewitnesses describe surveillance drones circling above protest zones, relaying live images to command centers as security forces use thermal scanners to identify hidden gatherings after dark. The government's sudden collapse has left a dangerous gap in authority, and in that void, the military's role is growing stronger by the hour. Regional analysts warn that this isn't an isolated political crisis. Around the world, conflicts are overlapping. Wars in Ukraine and the Middle East are already fueling a race for next-generation weapons, while African nations struggle with instability and rising foreign influence. Madagascar's turmoil arrives at a time when global powers are testing new military strategies, supplying allies with cutting-edge arms, and watching closely how smaller nations handle internal uprisings. For many, the question is no longer whether protests will turn violent, but how quickly governments will deploy battlefield tools like AI-driven surveillance and riot control drones to maintain control. International reaction has been swift but cautious. Neighboring African states are urging calm, while Western powers fear that any misstep could open the door to external interference. If the military decides to fill the power vacuum, Madagascar could become a proving ground for modern conflict, where political rebellion meets the relentless advance of war technology. The youth-led protests have already shown extraordinary courage, but they are now facing a state machinery capable of tracking, isolating, and neutralizing resistance with chilling precision. The coming days will decide whether democracy survives, or if military dominance takes its place. As night falls again over Madagascar, the sense of uncertainty deepens. With the government dismissed and the military tightening its grip, Citizens fear that the next chapter could spiral into a full-scale conflict. Reports from inside the capital describe armored convoys moving toward key government buildings, while communication blackouts leave neighborhoods cut off and desperate for information. Young protesters, many of them students, vow to continue their fight despite the overwhelming force against them. They share encrypted messages, evade surveillance drones, and adapt to tactics once reserved for war zones. The atmosphere feels less like a political dispute and more like the opening stages of a modern insurgency. Across the globe, military analysts are watching closely. The crisis in Madagascar reflects a growing pattern. Governments facing internal rebellion increasingly rely on advanced military technology to suppress dissent. From facial recognition cameras to AI-driven crowd prediction, the tools of warfare are now the tools of domestic control. These methods, tested in battlefields from Gaza to Eastern Europe, are being repurposed to silence protests and tighten political power. For the youth leading this movement, the challenge is monumental. They are not only confronting corruption and inequality, but also the cold efficiency of a state armed with next-generation weapons. The world's response will determine more than Madagascar's future. If global powers remain silent, it may embolden other regimes to crush dissent with similar force. But if the crisis draws international pressure or strategic intervention, it could ignite a wider regional conflict, pulling in foreign militaries and escalating beyond control. As Madagascar stands on the edge of chaos, it serves as a chilling reminder. In an age of rapid technological warfare, the line between political protest and armed conflict is thinner than ever. And tonight, that line is dangerously close to breaking.